Picture the scene. You already know it. A stable on a cold night, the air smelling of hay and animal warmth, a rough-hewn manger casting a soft glow at the center of everything. Mary is there, exhausted and luminous, and Joseph stands close behind her, one hand on the wooden railing, watching. Cattle shift in the shadows. A donkey lowers its head. To one side, a cluster of shepherds kneel in the straw, rough men, field men, their crooks laid aside, their faces open with something they cannot quite name. And to the other side, three figures who could not be more different from the shepherds, robed in deep jewel colors, wearing crowns, bearing lacquered boxes in their gloved hands. Their faces are grave and wise. One is young, one is middle-aged, one is ancient, white-bearded, bent slightly at the waist as he reaches forward with his gift. Above the stable, blazing in a black sky, a single enormous star hangs perfectly still, its light falling directly, intentionally, onto the child below. You know this scene. You have seen it on Christmas cards tucked into envelopes and stacked by the thousand on drugstore shelves. You have seen it in department store windows, lit from behind, in warm amber. You have seen it performed by 8-year-olds in bathrobes and tinsel halos in church fellowship halls every December. You have seen it in the Uffizi and the Louvre and the Prado, painted by masters whose names you were made to memorize in school: Botticelli, Da Vinci, Rubens, Dürer. The image has been reproduced more times than any other scene in the history of Western art. It is stitched onto pillowcases and stamped onto cookie tins and hung in brass-framed prints above 10 million fireplaces. It is, for a large portion of the human race, simply what happened. Not a tradition, not an interpretation, a record. A photograph, more or less, of a real night in a real place 2,000 years ago. But here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. When did you last read the actual source? Not a children's book version. Not a pageant script. Not a carol. Not a sermon summary delivered from a pulpit at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning in December. The source document itself. The text. The account that the scene is supposedly based on, word for word, in the oldest language in which we have it, which is not Hebrew and not Aramaic, but Greek, because when you do that, when you go directly to the text and read only what is there, something surprising happens. Several of the most familiar details in that scene you just pictured simply are not present. They are not in the account. They were added later, by other people, for reasons that made sense to them at the time, and they have been repeated so many times over so many centuries that they have fused with the original story in the popular imagination and become indistinguishable from it. The tradition has eaten the text. This is not an attack on Christmas. It is not an attack on faith or on the church, or on the people who have cherished this story for 2,000 years. The paintings are beautiful. The pageants are dear. The carols are among the most moving music the human species has produced. None of that is under dispute here. What is under dispute, or rather, what is simply being examined carefully, is the question of what the actual biblical text says versus what centuries of tradition have overlaid on top of it. These are two different things, and knowing the difference is not corrosive. It is clarifying. It is the kind of close reading that serious biblical scholars, careful theologians, and devout believers have been doing for centuries. There is nothing radical about reading a text and asking, what does this actually say? The account we are going to read is Matthew 2:1 through 2:12, 12 verses. That is the entire biblical record of the visitors from the East. It is the only place in the four Gospels where they appear. We are going to read it slowly, word by word where it matters, and in the original Greek where a single word turns out to carry enormous weight. And we are going to compare what the text actually says against what the popular tradition claims it says. The gaps are significant. They involve the number of visitors. They involve what those visitors should be called. They involve who those people actually were, professionally and religiously, and where they are likely to have come from. They involve the star they followed, and what it may or may not have been. They involve when they arrived, which turns out to be a more complicated question than most people realize. They involve where exactly they found the child and what kind of shelter he was in at the time. And they involve the names Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, which have been attached to these figures for so long that most people assume they are in the Bible, though they appear nowhere in it. This is a 12-part journey. It begins here with the familiar image, the one you already know, the one that lives in your memory as fact. It will move through the text verse by verse, pausing where the Greek matters, and where history can help us understand what Matthew's original audience would have heard. It will trace where the tradition came from, layer by layer, and how each addition made sense in its time, while quietly displacing what was actually written. And it will arrive at the end, back at Matthew's 12 verses, but reading them differently, reading them for what they are. The story in Matthew is stranger than the greeting card version, and richer, and more historically layered, and more theologically alive. The figures at its center are more foreign, more dangerous, and more surprising than the robed kings of the pageant. The setting is not what most people picture. The timing is not what most people assume. And the point Matthew is making with this story, the specific, deliberate, carefully constructed theological argument he is building, is almost entirely invisible when the tradition is sitting on top of it like sediment. When you clear the sediment, the original carving is startling in its clarity. That is worth the journey. Let us begin. There are 4 Gospels in the New Testament canon. 4 separate accounts of Jesus' life, each written by a different author, for a different audience, in a different place, at a different time, with a different set of theological priorities. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They overlap in places, diverge in others, and together they have shaped the religious imagination of the Western world for 2 millennia. But they are not identical, and they are not interchangeable, and one of the most important things you can do when reading any one of them is to resist the instinct to fill in details from the others. That matters enormously for the story we are examining. Because the visitors from the East, the Magi, the figures at the center of this entire inquiry, appear in exactly one of those 4 Gospels. 1. Not 2, not 3, not all 4. Matthew, and Matthew alone, contains the account of the Eastern visitors and the star, and the meeting with Herod and the gifts. If Matthew had not written it, the story would not exist in the Bible at all. Mark's Gospel doesn't have a birth narrative. It begins abruptly, at the moment John the Baptist appears in the wilderness, and Jesus comes to be baptized as an adult. There are no angels, no manger, no star, no visitors of any kind. Mark's Jesus enters the story fully grown, and the account wastes no time getting to the ministry. If you read only Mark, you would know nothing of Bethlehem. John's Gospel opens with a cosmic, theological prologue, rather than a birth story. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John is not describing a birth in a physical location on a particular night. He is making a metaphysical claim about the eternal nature of Christ. There are no shepherds, no manger, no magi, no star. The prologue of John and the birth narratives of Matthew and Luke are doing completely different kinds of work. Luke's Gospel does have a birth narrative, and it is a rich one. It contains the angel Gabriel announcing the pregnancy to Mary. It contains the census that brings Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem. It contains the manger, because there was no room in the inn. It contains the angels appearing to shepherds in the fields outside the city, the heavenly host singing, the shepherds rushing to find the child, and then returning to their fields, glorifying God. Luke's account is the one most responsible for the stable, the manger, and the shepherds. It is beautiful, it is detailed, it is theologically careful, and it contains absolutely no magi, no star that functions as a travel guide, no visitors from the east, no Herod, no gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The magi are absent from Luke as completely as the shepherds are absent from Matthew. This is the fact that the popular nativity scene quietly erases. The shepherds and the magi are not in the same story. They come from two different Gospels, written by two different authors, describing two different groups of visitors. The Christmas pageant that places both groups kneeling simultaneously before the same manger is a theatrical composite, a blending of two accounts into one scene that neither account actually describes. The blend is old, beloved, and has its own integrity as a devotional tradition. But it is a blend, and the blending comes at a cost, because it erases choices that both Matthew and Luke made deliberately. When you merge the accounts, you stop asking why Matthew omitted shepherds and why Luke omitted magi, and those are questions with genuinely interesting answers. So why is the magi story in Matthew and not in Luke? The short answer lies in who Matthew was writing for and what he was trying to accomplish. Matthew's Gospel is widely understood by scholars to have been written primarily for a Jewish Christian audience, a community of followers of Jesus who were themselves rooted in the Jewish tradition and who needed to understand Jesus in relation to the Hebrew scriptures they already knew. Matthew's solution was to saturate his account in Old Testament quotation and fulfillment language. The phrase, "This happened to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet," appears again and again in Matthew, like a refrain. No other gospel uses it so consistently or so deliberately. In the second chapter of Matthew alone, the fulfillment citations come in rapid succession. Micah 5.2, quoted to explain why the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Hosea 11.1, cited when the family flees to Egypt and then returns. "Out of Egypt I called my son." Jeremiah 31-15, invoked when Herod kills the children of Bethlehem. Rachel weeping for her children. Matthew is not simply telling a story. He is making an argument. He is showing, citation by citation, that the life of Jesus maps onto the pattern of Israel's own history and its prophetic literature. Every major event in the birth narrative is anchored to a text his audience would have known by heart. The Magi story fits into this project with particular precision. Foreign visitors from the east, drawn to Israel's Messiah by the stars, arriving in Jerusalem to honor the newborn king. This is exactly the kind of scene Matthew needed to establish one of his central claims, that the coming of Jesus is not only for Israel, but for all nations. The Gentiles come first. Before any teaching, before any miracle, before the public ministry begins, the first people outside the immediate family to seek out the child are foreigners. Outsiders. People from a different culture, a different religion, and a different part of the world entirely. Matthew plants this flag in the very beginning of his narrative, because it is not a minor detail. It is a thesis statement. The Gospel was likely composed between 80 and 90 CE, roughly half a century after the events it describes, drawing on earlier sources, including the Gospel of Mark and a hypothetical sayings collection scholars call Q. The traditional attribution to Matthew the Apostle is ancient and venerable. Most modern scholars believe it was written by a later Jewish Christian community working in his name and tradition. For believers, this does not diminish the Gospel's authority. For everyone, it situates it historically. A document written by a particular community, for a particular audience, with a particular set of purposes. All of that context is the frame around 12 verses. The verses themselves begin with a single sentence that contains more than it appears to. Matthew 2:1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. Pause on what is already present in that sentence. A location, Bethlehem, then Jerusalem. A time marker, during Herod's reign, and a group of people who are called, in the original Greek, something that the English translation only partially captures. They are not called wise men in the Greek. They are not called kings. The word Matthew uses is specific, loaded with history, and far more interesting than either of those labels. Everything that follows depends on understanding what that word actually meant to Matthew's original readers, and what it tells us about who these visitors really were. The word Matthew uses in chapter 2, verse 1 is magoi. In Greek, the singular form is magos. It is the direct ancestor of the English words magic and magician, which tells you something immediately, and also misleads you slightly, because in the ancient world, magos had a meaning far more specific and far more serious than a stage conjurer or a fairy tale enchanter. When a Greek-speaking audience in the 1st century read or heard the word magos, they did not picture a man in a pointed hat. They pictured something closer to what we might call a scholar priest, a trained professional from a recognized religious and intellectual tradition, someone who occupied a formal role in a society that took the interpretation of celestial signs and sacred dreams with the same gravity that modern society gives to medicine or law. The magoi of Matthew's account belong most naturally to the priestly caste of ancient Persia and Media. These were the Magi, the hereditary priest class of the Persian Empire, attached to the Zoroastrian religious tradition that had dominated the Iranian plateau since at least the 6th century BCE. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, describes the Magi as a priestly tribe among the Medes who interpreted dreams for the Persian royal court and presided over Zoroastrian ritual. They were not marginal figures. They were embedded in the power structures of one of the greatest empires the ancient world had ever seen. Zoroastrianism had a profound investment in the observation of the sky. The Magi were trained watchers of celestial events, not in the superstitious sense that the word astrology tends to carry today, but in the sense of a rigorous, systematic discipline of astronomical record-keeping that had been refined over centuries alongside Babylonian astronomical science. When a magus observed something unusual in the sky, he interpreted it through a framework of religious and political meaning his tradition had developed across generations. This makes Matthew's account immediately coherent in a way that wise men does not. People who would notice an anomalous celestial event and interpret it as the birth sign of a king are precisely these priestly astronomers. Calling them wise men flattens that specificity into something vaguely philosophical. Calling them what they actually were gives the story its historical texture back. The English phrase, wise men, comes primarily from the King James Version of 1611, which renders the Greek as, "There came wise men from the east to Jerusalem." The KJV is a magnificent piece of literature, but wise men is an interpretive choice, not a translation. The word wise imports a philosophical and moral connotation, virtue, experience, broad learning, that is not present in the Greek word magos. The NIV renders it correctly as magi. The NRSV uses wise men, but footnotes the Greek. Many modern scholarly translations use astrologers, or simply transliterate it as magi. The Greek says something more specific than wise men, and that specificity matters. The shift from magoi to wise men was gradual. Jerome's Latin Vulgate, completed around 4005 CE, actually translates the word correctly. He uses magi. But the commentary tradition surrounding the Vulgate increasingly reached for sapientes, the wise ones, alongside magi, and the two terms blurred in popular usage. By the time the KJV translators made their choices in the early 17th century, wise men was already deeply embedded in Western tradition. The translation reflected what everyone believed, and what everyone believed had been shaped by centuries of prior translation choices. It is a feedback loop, and difficult to exit once it has been running for several hundred years. The word kings, however, is not even a translation of anything in Matthew's text. It is not a rendering of a Greek word that sort of means kings. The word kings appears nowhere in Matthew 2. Not once, in any verse, in any manuscript tradition, the royal title was not translated into the Magi story from the Greek. It was projected onto the story from outside the text entirely. The source is almost certainly Old Testament typology. Psalm 72:10-11. May the kings of Sheba and Seba present him gifts. May all kings bow down to him. Isaiah 63. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Isaiah 66 adds gold and incense brought from Sheba. Early Christian readers, saturated in the Hebrew scriptures, identified the Magi as the fulfillment of these royal prophecies. If Scripture said kings would bring gifts and bow down, and these figures brought gifts and bowed down, then they must be those kings. Tertullian, writing around 200 CE, was among the first to call them kings explicitly. Origen developed the identification further. By the medieval period, it was standard. In 1857, an American Episcopal priest named John Henry Hopkins, Jr. wrote a carol called "We Three Kings of Orient Are" for a Christmas pageant. It is catchy, beloved, and sung by millions every December. It is also, from the first word of its title, working entirely from tradition rather than text. Hopkins was drawing on a centuries-old identification that felt, by his time, completely settled. But the title encodes three separate claims: that there were three of them, that they were kings, that they came from the Orient, none of which appear as stated facts in Matthew. All three are traditional accretions, and the carol cemented them permanently. The same Greek root appears elsewhere in the New Testament, and the contrast is instructive. In Acts 8:9, a man named Simon Magus practiced sorcery in Samaria and tried to purchase the power of the Holy Spirit from the apostles. In Acts 13:6-8, a man called Elymas is described as a magos, a false prophet and sorcerer who opposes Paul on Cyprus. In both cases, the root carries a sharply negative charge. These are not respected priestly scholars. They are frauds. The word's range, then, runs from Zoroastrian court astronomers at one end to itinerant charlatans at the other, much as prophet or priest can describe figures of genuine authority or dangerous imposture. What places Matthew's magoi at the serious end is everything else in the passage. They have resources sufficient for a journey of hundreds of miles, they gain a private audience with one of the most paranoid rulers in the Near East. They offer gifts of enormous value, and Matthew treats them with unmistakable dignity and theological weight. They are not hedge wizards. They are the real thing of their own tradition, a priestly, astronomical, Persian tradition that has nothing to do with Christmas card crowns. Matthew calls them magoi. The word matters. It tells you where they came from, what they did, why they were watching the sky, and what kind of intellectual and religious framework made them capable of reading a celestial event as a message about a king. Wise men is a softening, kings is an invention. Magoi is what the text says, and what the text says is more interesting than either of the labels that replaced it. Here is the simplest question you can ask about the Magi, and the one with the most straightforward answer: how many were there? Matthew never says. Read Matthew 2:1 through 2:12 in its entirety, all 12 verses, and you will not find a number. The text says, Magi came from the east. It does not say 2 Magi, or 3, or 5, or 12. There is no count, no head count at the gate of Jerusalem, no seating arrangement at Herod's audience, no accounting of who carried which gift. The visitors arrive collectively, they speak collectively, they are warned in a dream collectively, and they depart collectively. And at no point does Matthew pause to tell you how many people he is describing. For a story that billions of people know as the story of the 3 wise men, the number 3 is nowhere in it. This is not a matter of translation or manuscript variation. It is not a case where some ancient copies say 3 and others say a different number. Every manuscript tradition of Matthew 2 is consistent on this point. The number is simply not stated. The Greek text gives you magoi, magi, plural, more than one, and nothing further. If you want to know how many there were, Matthew will not help you. So where does 3 come from? The answer is almost embarrassingly simple once you see it. Matthew 2:11 names 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. 3 gifts were presented, and from there the reasoning runs. 3 gifts means 3 givers, 1 gift per visitor, therefore 3 magi. It is a logical inference. It has a clean, satisfying symmetry to it. It is also entirely an assumption, a piece of arithmetic that the text doesn't perform and doesn't authorize. A group of 10 people can present 3 gifts. A group of 2 can present 3 gifts. Matthew records what was given, not how many hands gave it, and the 1 gift per person equation is something the reader supplies from outside the text. The inference is ancient. It was being made at least by the 3rd century CE, and Origen of Alexandria, one of the most brilliant and influential theologians of the early Church, whose writings shaped Christian doctrine across centuries, is among the earliest major figures on record making it explicitly. Origen connected the 3 gifts to 3 visitors as an interpretation, and because Origen's influence on subsequent Western theology was enormous, that interpretation propagated. It was repeated in commentaries, embedded in sermons, illustrated in Christian art, and eventually stopped feeling like an interpretation at all. By the medieval period, it was simply the received account. But Origen himself was doing theology, not reporting account. He was finding meaning in a pattern, not correcting a transcription error. The authority he carried as an interpreter allowed his reading to harden into apparent fact, which is a process that happens frequently in the history of tradition and almost never announces itself while it is happening. What makes this particularly interesting is that the Eastern Church did not follow the same path. The Syriac Christian tradition, one of the oldest continuous Christian communities in the world, preserving forms of the faith that reach back toward the earliest centuries, maintained a quite different count for a long time. In Syriac tradition, the number of magi was frequently given as 12. Not 3. 12. The symbolic logic behind 12 was different from the logic behind 3, but equally coherent. 12 magi to represent the 12 tribes of Israel, or 12 apostles, or all the nations of the world. 12 felt theologically complete in the Syriac framework, for much the same reason that 3 felt theologically complete in the Western framework, because both numbers carry enormous symbolic freight in the biblical tradition, and because both were being applied to a text that stated neither. Some scholars of early Christianity have noted that the Syriac tradition's 12 magi reading may actually be older than the Western 3 magi reading, or at least as old, and that the triumph of 3 in Western Christianity reflects the dominance of particular theologians and the particular OT texts they favored, rather than any privileged access to historical memory. Both traditions were constructing a number. The text gave them nothing to correct. There is a further possibility that rarely gets airtime in popular discussions of the Nativity, which is that Matthew's silence on the number might be deliberate rather than accidental. Matthew's account is, as we have already noted, a spare piece of writing for something carrying as much theological weight as it does. He does not describe what the Magi looked like. He does not name them. He does not detail their journey. He does not tell us how long they traveled or where exactly they came from. He gives us the minimum required to make his argument, and then stops. In that context, the absence of a number may not be an oversight. It may reflect that Matthew did not know the number, or that he had no reliable tradition to draw on, or, perhaps most interestingly, that a specific number would have worked against his purpose. The Magi in Matthew function as representatives. They stand for the Gentile world coming to recognize Israel's Messiah. Fixing them at a precise count of 3 makes them 3 specific individuals. Leaving the count open makes them something more like a symbol, any number of people, from any distance, drawn by the same light. The vagueness may be the point. None of this means that 3 is a dishonest or unreasonable tradition. It is ancient. It has theological coherence. It has been held by the vast majority of Christians throughout history, and it gave rise to some of the most beautiful religious art ever made. Triptychs and altarpieces, and illuminated manuscripts across 1,000 years of European Christianity are organized around 3 figures, and the visual rhythm of that trinity of visitors has an undeniable power. The tradition earns its place on aesthetic and theological grounds, but it earns that place as tradition. It doesn't earn it as text. 3 wise men is what Christians came to believe and depict and celebrate. 3 magi is not what Matthew wrote, because Matthew wrote no number at all. The difference between those 2 statements is small in practice and significant in principle. It is the difference between the Bible says and the church teaches, a distinction that, in this story, almost no one makes but almost everyone should know. Of all the details in Matthew's account, the star is the one that has generated the most ink, scholarly, theological, and astronomical, across 2,000 years. Planetariums run special Christmas shows devoted to it. Scientists have proposed candidates. Theologians have argued about whether the question is even the right one to ask. It is the element of the story that sits most uncomfortably at the border between history and miracle, between the explicable and the inexplicable, and that discomfort has made it irresistible to almost everyone who has ever read the passage carefully. Matthew 2 records the Magi saying, "We saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. The Greek word for star here is aster, the ordinary Greek word for any luminous body in the sky, the root from which English gets astronomy and asterisk. It does not specify a comet, a planet, a conjunction of planets, a nova, or a supernatural light. It says star. Matthew uses it again in verse 9, where he describes what happened after the Magi left Herod's palace. The star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. Two appearances of the same word, and neither one gives an astronomer much to work with in terms of identification. But the second appearance gives a theologian quite a lot to think about, because what Matthew describes in verse 9 is a star that moves through the sky in a directed way and then stops over a specific house. That is not how stars behave. That is not how any natural celestial object behaves. We will return to that detail. First, the natural candidates, because they are genuinely interesting and deserve a fair hearing. The most discussed astronomical candidate is a series of conjunctions between Jupiter and Saturn in 7 BCE. In that year, the two planets passed close to each other in the sky 3 times, a rare triple conjunction that would have been highly visible and significant to any trained observer. The conjunctions took place in Pisces, which in ancient astrological tradition was associated with Judea and the Hebrew people. Jupiter was the royal planet, the planet of kings, and Saturn was associated in some traditions with the deity of the Jews. A triple conjunction of those two planets in that constellation would have been precisely the kind of event that Zoroastrian priest astronomers were trained to notice and interpret. The scholar Johannes Kepler, writing in the 17th century, was among the first to propose this conjunction as the Star of Bethlehem, and the idea has had serious supporters ever since. Halley's comet is sometimes proposed, but runs into a timing problem. It passed in 12 BCE, which is earlier than most scholarly estimates of Jesus' birth, and well outside even the most generous chronological windows. Chinese astronomical records from around 5 BCE describe an unusual object, possibly a nova or a slow-moving comet, that appeared in the constellation Aquila and remained visible for some weeks. A handful of scholars have pointed to this as a possible candidate, since it would have been anomalous enough to attract attention, and its timing is roughly compatible with a birth date in the 6 to 4 BCE range. Jupiter alone has its own advocates. In ancient astrology, Jupiter was consistently identified as the planet of kings and of divine favor. Its retrograde motion, the apparent backward drift that all outer planets exhibit from Earth's perspective as the planets pass each other in their orbits, creates the visual impression of a planet slowing, stopping, and reversing direction in the sky. For an observer watching Jupiter over weeks and months, it would appear to pause and then move again, which some scholars have proposed as the naturalistic explanation for Matthew's description of the star stopping over the child's location. The problem with this reading is that Jupiter's retrograde motion, while visually striking over a period of weeks, does not narrow down a location to a single house on a single street, which is what Matthew's narrative requires. That problem is the theological reading's strongest argument. Many scholars and theologians, including many who take the historical reliability of Matthew's account seriously, argue that the star in Matthew 2 is not intended as a natural phenomenon whose identity we can recover through astronomical detective work. It is a theological and literary device, a sign of divine guidance, a pointer from heaven to earth, operating by different rules than the objects tracked in astronomical tables. Under this reading, asking what the star was astronomically is like asking what species of bird descended on Jesus at his baptism when the Spirit came upon him. The text says it was a dove. No ornithologist is required. The language is doing something other than natural history. The OT precedent for this reading is strong and specific. Numbers 24:17 contains one of the most widely cited messianic prophecies in the Hebrew Scriptures. A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. This oracle, spoken by the pagan prophet Balaam, was read by Jewish interpreters in the centuries around Jesus' birth as pointing toward the coming of a royal figure, a messianic king from Israel. The Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran applied it to their expected leader. Various messianic movements in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE invoked it. Matthew, writing for an audience fluent in this prophetic tradition, would have known exactly what his readers would hear when he introduced a star associated with the birth of the King of the Jews. He was not simply reporting a celestial event. He was placing the birth of Jesus inside the prophetic framework his audience already carried. Under this theological reading, the star's strange behavior in Matthew, moving, pausing, leading, stopping, is not a problem to be solved by astronomy. It is the point. The star does what divine signs do in the biblical narrative. It goes where God directs it. The pillar of cloud led Israel through the wilderness. The star leads the Magi to the child. The mechanism is not the message. Whichever reading one finds more persuasive, one fact remains. The behavior Matthew describes in verse 9, a star that travels through the sky and stops over a single house, cannot be fully accounted for by any natural phenomenon currently proposed. No planet, no comet, no nova, no conjunction performs that specific action. The irreducible strangeness of Matthew's star is not a problem introduced by careless readers. It is built into the text by Matthew himself. He wrote a star that stops over a house, and he apparently intended that to mean something that ordinary astronomy was not equipped to express. The most honest answer to the question of what the star was is that we do not know, and that Matthew may not have meant for us to know in the way the question usually demands. What Matthew meant for us to understand is different and simpler. The heavens announced this birth to people who were listening, people from far outside the covenant of Israel, and they came. The star is not a puzzle to be decoded. It is a declaration to be received. Matthew tells us the Magi came from the east. That is the whole of the geographical information he provides. No country is named, no city, no region, no route. The Greek phrase is apo anatolon, literally from the risings, meaning from the direction of the rising sun, which is to say, the east. It is a compass direction, not an address. Matthew does not tell us where these men began their journey, and anyone who claims to know with certainty is working from something other than Matthew's text. That said, the text does not leave us entirely without clues. The word magoi, as we have already examined in detail, points with some force toward Persia and the surrounding region. The Zoroastrian Magi were a Persian and Median institution. Their tradition of astronomical observation was rooted in Mesopotamia. Babylon, in particular, had been the center of the ancient world's most advanced mathematical astronomy for centuries before the Common Era. Babylonian astronomers had computed planetary tables, predicted eclipses, and tracked celestial cycles with a precision that would not be equaled in Europe until the Renaissance. If you wanted to find people in the ancient world who were watching the sky with the sophistication and theological framework required to interpret a new celestial event as the birth of a king, the region stretching from Babylon eastward through Persia is where you would look first. The word Matthew uses points there. The skill set his narrative requires points there. Persia and Babylonia are the strongest candidates on the evidence available. Arabia is the other serious contender, and its case rests primarily on the gifts. Frankincense and myrrh, two of the three items presented to the child, were among the most commercially valuable commodities in the ancient world, and both were produced in a very specific part of it. Frankincense comes from the resin of boswellia trees that grow in the Dhofar region of modern Oman and in parts of Somalia and Yemen. Myrrh comes from the thorny commiphora tree, native to similar terrain across the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. Both resins were harvested, processed, and traded northward along the ancient incense routes that ran through Arabia, up through the Hejaz and Nabatean territory, toward the Mediterranean world. A caravan bearing frankincense and myrrh would most naturally originate from, or pass through, the Arabian Peninsula. Isaiah 60 contributed its own geographical suggestion to the popular tradition. The passage, which Matthew's readers would have known as a vision of nations streaming to a restored Jerusalem, mentions camels from Midian and Ephah, and gold and incense coming from Sheba, the ancient kingdom of southern Arabia. Early Christians reading Matthew's Magi story through Isaiah 60 naturally associated the Magi with these Arabian visitors, and the Arabian connection gradually fused with the Persian priestly identity in the composite tradition. By the time the naming traditions fixed Balthasar as a dark-skinned man from Arabia and Melchior as a Persian elder, both strands had been woven together into a single image. But they came from different threads, and Matthew supplies neither. Egypt is occasionally proposed as the Magi's origin, but the case is thin. There is no strong textual or historical reason to read the East as pointing toward Egypt, which lies to the southwest of Jerusalem, not the East. The proposal tends to surface in readings that want to connect the Magi to the Alexandrian Jewish intellectual tradition or to Egyptian astrological practice, both of which were real and significant in the ancient world, but neither of which is what Matthew's word magoi most naturally evokes. Then there are the camels, the Magi in virtually every nativity scene, every Christmas card, and every church pageant ride camels, 3 of them, typically, 1 per magus, often shown in silhouette against a dramatic sky as they crest a desert dune. Matthew says nothing about camels, not one word. No mode of transport is mentioned anywhere in Matthew 2. The Magi arrive in Jerusalem. They depart for Bethlehem. They are warned in a dream and return to their country by another route. We are never told how they traveled. The camels come from Isaiah 66, which speaks of caravans of camels covering the land and bringing gold and frankincense. Since early Christian interpreters were already reading Isaiah 60 as a prophecy fulfilled by the Magi, the camels of Isaiah 60 migrated naturally into the visual tradition of the Magi's journey. It is another case of Old Testament typology reshaping the popular image of the story, the same mechanism that gave us kings, the same mechanism that gave us the Arabian geography operating again with the same quiet efficiency. The text provides a prophecy. The prophecy contains an image. The image attaches itself to the story the prophecy was thought to predict. Matthew's account absorbs the imagery of the texts interpreted as its own backdrop, and after enough repetitions, nobody can tell the original from the overlay. The journey itself, whatever its mode of transport, was not short. Jerusalem sits at the western end of the Fertile Crescent. Babylon lies roughly 1,000 miles to the east along the ancient road that follows the Euphrates River Valley. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, is further still. Even if the Magi came from the nearer reaches of Mesopotamia, their journey would have taken weeks under good conditions, and more likely months. Ancient caravan travel moved at roughly 20 to 30 miles per day, depending on terrain, weather, and the size of the party. A journey of 1,000 miles on those roads was a serious undertaking. Not a weekend trip, but an expedition requiring significant resources, planning, and commitment. This travel time matters for a reason that will become clearer in a later chapter. It is one of several factors suggesting that the Magi didn't arrive on the night of Jesus' birth or anywhere close to it. A journey of weeks or months from the east, combined with other details Matthew builds into his account, paints a picture of visitors who arrived substantially after the event that set them traveling. The popular image of 3 crowned figures kneeling beside the manger on the night of the Nativity collapses the timeline in a way that Matthew's own narrative doesn't support. But that belongs to the chapter on the house, not this one. For now, the point is simpler. Matthew says east. He means it in the broad, symbolic sense of the world beyond Israel's borders, the Gentile world from which no one expected good news about a Jewish king to travel, and from which Matthew is about to demonstrate it traveled anyway. The specific geography was perhaps less important to him than the theological direction of the journey, outward, foreign, far away, and arriving nonetheless. Not every figure in Matthew's nativity account is shrouded in historical uncertainty. One of them is among the most thoroughly documented rulers of the ancient Near East, a man whose building projects, political maneuvering, family murders, and eventual death are recorded in substantial detail by the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote about him at length in the 1st century CE. His name was Herod, and understanding who he actually was transforms the atmosphere of Matthew's account from the gentle, golden warmth of the Christmas card into something considerably darker and more historically plausible. Herod the Great ruled Judea from approximately 37 BCE until his death in 4 BCE. He had been appointed king by Rome, specifically by Mark Antony and the Roman Senate, which meant his legitimacy, in the eyes of his own Jewish subjects, was perpetually contested. He was ethnically Idumean, the descendant of a people forcibly converted to Judaism a generation earlier, and many Jews considered him at best an imperfect Jew, and at worst a foreign impostor, wearing the title of King of the Jews while serving the interests of Rome. This insecurity about legitimacy was not paranoia without basis. It was a real political condition, and Herod spent his entire reign managing it with a combination of spectacular public generosity and ruthless private violence. On the generosity side, Herod was one of the greatest builders of the ancient world. He reconstructed the Jerusalem temple on a scale that made it one of the most magnificent structures in the Roman Empire. The massive retaining walls he built around the Temple Mount still stand in Jerusalem today. What tourists call the Western Wall is a remnant of Herod's construction. He built Caesarea Maritima from scratch, the desert fortress of Masada, the palace complex of Herodium, and dozens of other projects. By the standards of the ancient world, Herod built like a god. On the violence side, the record is equally extraordinary. He executed at least 3 of his own sons when he suspected them of plotting against him, and he executed his wife Mariamne before, apparently grieving her so intensely he was briefly incapacitated, then recovered and executed her mother as well. The Emperor Augustus reportedly made a bitter pun in Greek. It was safer to be Herod's pig than his son, the joke being that as a nominal Jew, Herod would not slaughter a pig, but showed no such restraint with his children. This is the man the Magi walked in to see. Matthew 2:3 records that when Herod heard the Magi asking about the one-born king of the Jews, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. The second half of that sentence is often overlooked but carries its own weight. all Jerusalem with him. Matthew is suggesting that Herod's alarm was publicly visible, and that the people of Jerusalem, who had decades of experience reading Herod's moods as leading indicators of their own safety, felt the chill of it. A disturbed Herod was a dangerous Herod, and everyone in Jerusalem knew it. Herod's response is methodical and revealing. He calls together the chief priests and scribes, the religious leadership of Jerusalem, and asks them where the Messiah was prophesied to be born. They give him the answer from Micah 5:2, Bethlehem. He then summons the Magi privately and asks them a question that Matthew records with careful precision. He asks them the exact time the star had appeared. Matthew includes this detail because it matters for what comes later. Herod is not making conversation. He is calculating. He wants to know how old the child might be, and he files that information away. Then he sends the Magi to Bethlehem with instructions to find the child and report back, telling them he too wants to come and worship. Matthew makes no comment on this claim, but no reader is meant to believe it. The Magi do not return. Warned in a dream, one of several dreams that serve as divine communication devices throughout Matthew's birth narrative, they go home by a different route. Herod waits. Then, when he realizes he has been outwitted, Matthew 2:16 records what he does. He orders the killing of all male children in Bethlehem and the surrounding region who are 2 years old and under, calculating from the time the Magi had reported seeing the star. The event is known in Christian tradition as the Massacre of the Innocents. No non-biblical historical source records this massacre, and this is sometimes cited as evidence against its historicity. But the argument runs into a demographic problem. Bethlehem was a small village. The number of male children under 2 in such a settlement would have been, by modern demographic estimates, somewhere between a dozen and 30. Josephus recorded Herod's large-scale atrocities in detail, but was writing about palace intrigues and massacres in major cities. A killing of 20 or 30 children in a rural village sat beneath the threshold of events that made it into the written record. Its absence from Josephus is not evidence of impossibility. It is evidence of the size of Bethlehem. Whether or not the massacre occurred exactly as Matthew describes, its function in the narrative is precise. It establishes Herod as the anti-king, the false ruler who holds the title while the true king is born elsewhere, and it echoes with deliberate force the story of Pharaoh ordering the killing of Hebrew infant boys in Exodus, the event from which Moses was saved by being hidden in a basket on the Nile. Matthew is doing what he does throughout his gospel, showing that the story of Jesus recapitulates the story of Israel. A wicked king tries to destroy the deliverer in his infancy. The deliverer escapes. Later he comes out of Egypt. Matthew 2:15 quotes Hosea 11:1, "Out of Egypt I called my son," to make the typology explicit. Herod died in 4 BCE, probably in Jericho, of a disease whose symptoms Josephus describes in gruesome detail. His death is one of the fixed chronological anchors of the entire nativity narrative. Because Matthew places Jesus' birth during Herod's reign, the birth must have occurred before 4 BCE. Most scholars settle on a date somewhere between 6 and 4 BCE, which produces the famous irony that the man whose birth divided our calendar was almost certainly born several years before the year labeled one in that calendar, the result of a 6th century monk named Dionysius Exiguus, miscalculating when he designed the BC/AD system. In Matthew's narrative, Herod serves a function that is as theological as it is historical. He is the perfect foil for the Magi. The Magi are foreigners, pagans by any Jewish standard, arriving from outside the covenant with no claim on Israel's promises, and they come to honor the king. Herod is the sitting king of the Jews, appointed and powerful, surrounded by scribes who can quote the relevant prophecy from memory, and he tries to have the king killed. Matthew has arranged these figures against each other with the precision of a writer who knows exactly what he is doing. The outsiders see, the insider destroys. That contrast is not decoration, it is the argument. Matthew 2:11 reads, "On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him." The Greek word translated house is oikion, a form of oikos, the standard Greek word for a house or household dwelling. Not a stable, not a barn, not a cave, not an inn or the back of an inn. A house. It is one of the plainest words in the Greek language, and Matthew uses it without qualification or apology, as though the detail requires no explanation at all, because to his original readers it presumably did not. The stable, the cold stone structure or wooden shelter housing cattle, the manger filled with hay, the animals breathing in the lamplight, comes from Luke, not Matthew. Luke 2:7 records that Mary wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no guest room available for them. That is the origin of the stable and the manger in the nativity tradition. It is Luke's setting, Luke's detail, Luke's account of the night of the birth. And as we have already established, the Magi are entirely absent from Luke. They do not appear anywhere in his birth narrative. The shepherds are Luke's. The manger is Luke's. The Magi are Matthew's. They belong to different accounts, and the accounts are not describing the same night. The popular nativity scene solves this separation by simply ignoring it. It takes Luke's stable and manger and fills them with Matthew's magi, creating a composite image that requires both authors to be wrong, or rather, requires the reader to stop paying attention to what each author specifically chose to write. Luke chose to write about shepherds and a manger. Matthew chose to write about magi and a house. When you blend the two scenes into one, you override both choices simultaneously. You get a picture that is more complete and more satisfying than either original account, in the same way that a composite photograph of two faces is sometimes more symmetrical than either face alone, and equally fictional as a portrait of either person. If Matthew says house, the obvious question is, what happened to the stable? The most natural answer is that by the time the Magi arrived, the Holy Family was no longer in the place where Jesus had been born. They had moved. Whether they found lodging with relatives in Bethlehem, Joseph, according to Luke, was of the house and lineage of David, which means Bethlehem was, in some sense, his ancestral town, or whether they had simply rented a room in a private home, they were living under a roof by the time the visitors from the east came calling. The manger of the birth night was the manger of the birth night, not the permanent address of the family. This reading is strongly supported by the one piece of internal evidence Matthew provides that functions as a rough timestamp. In Matthew 2:7, Herod privately asks the Magi when exactly they first saw the star. Matthew notes this detail quietly, without fanfare, but it is one of the most revealing sentences in the passage. Herod asks the question because he is calculating. He wants to know the outer boundary of the child's age. Then in Matthew 2:16, after the Magi fail to return, Herod issues his decree targeting all male children in Bethlehem, 2 years old and under, and Matthew specifies the basis for that number. It was calibrated to the time Herod had learned from the Magi. 2 years old and under. Herod is casting a net wide enough to catch a child who might have been born as long as 2 years before the Magi's arrival. This is not speculation introduced by modern skeptics trying to destabilize the Christmas story. It is the internal logic of Matthew's own text, spelled out in consecutive verses. If the star appeared at or near the time of the birth, and if Herod's 2-year window was set to cover the full range of possibility, then the Magi's visit could have occurred anywhere from shortly after the birth to as much as 2 years afterward. Many scholars read the 2-year window as suggesting the visit was likely at least a year after the birth. Herod was cautious and calculating, not careless, and he would have set his margin generously rather than riskily. A toddler, not a newborn, is what the evidence in Matthew's own account most naturally points toward. The Greek word Matthew uses for Jesus when the Magi find him reinforces this. In verses 9 and 11, Matthew calls Jesus paidion, a word that refers to a young child in a general sense. It does not mean newborn. It does not mean infant. The Greek word for a newborn or infant is brephos, and that is the word Luke uses in his birth scene. You will find a brephos wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. Matthew uses brephos nowhere in his account of the Magi visit. He uses paidion, which is entirely consistent with a walking, talking toddler, and not specifically consistent with a child who was born last night. The vocabulary difference between the two authors, at this single point of comparison, quietly confirms what the Herod timeline and the house detail are already telling us. The Magi arrived later, possibly much later. None of this is a minor revision to the nativity scene. It is a structural correction. The stable, the manger, the newborn in swaddling cloths, the animals, the shepherds, the Magi. The unified image requires all of those elements to exist simultaneously in the same place at the same time. But they do not in the texts that supposedly describe them. Luke's elements and Matthew's elements belong to different moments. Luke's shepherds came on the night of the birth to a manger and found a newborn. Matthew's Magi came later. The text will not let us say exactly how much later, but later, to a house, and found a child. Placing both groups at the same manger on the same night requires ignoring the word oikion in Matthew 2:11, ignoring the word paidion in Matthew 2:9, and ignoring the 2-year window in Matthew 2:16. It requires, in other words, not reading Matthew. Matthew says house. That single word, in its plainness and its specificity, separates the Magi's visit from the birth night as clearly as anything in the text. The stable belongs to Luke. The house belongs to Matthew. And no nativity scene that puts the Magi in the stable is accurately representing what either author wrote. Matthew 2:11 continues, Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. 3 gifts. It is the only numerically specific detail in the entire passage about the Magi. And as we established in an earlier chapter, it is almost certainly the single point from which the entire tradition of 3 Magi was derived. The arithmetic is seductive. 3 gifts, therefore 3 givers, therefore 3 wise men. But before we revisit that inference, the gifts themselves deserve attention, because each one carried specific meaning in the ancient world that Matthew's original audience would have recognized immediately, and that meaning has been elaborated, theologized, and in some respects simplified by the tradition that followed. Gold needs the least explanation. It was the metal of kings and of gods across virtually every culture of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world. When a subject presented gold to a ruler, the act communicated acknowledgement of sovereignty. When gold was offered in a religious context, it communicated that the recipient was of divine significance. In the Jerusalem temple, gold was everywhere. The menorah, the altar of incense, the Ark of the Covenant, the overlay of the innermost sanctuary. Its presence in the Magi's gifts signals, within the symbolic vocabulary of the ancient world, that the child they were honoring occupied the highest possible category of human or divine standing. That Matthew lists gold first is likely not accidental. Frankincense is a resin, a hardened, aromatic tree sap harvested from boswellia trees that grow in the arid highlands of the Arabian Peninsula, the Horn of Africa, and parts of India. When burned, it produces a fragrant, billowing smoke that has been used in religious ritual across the ancient world for millennia, in Egyptian temples, in the Jerusalem cult, in Roman state religion, in Zoroastrian fire ceremonies. In the Hebrew Bible, frankincense was a prescribed component of the sacred incense burned before God in the tabernacle and later the temple. Exodus 30:34 specifies the formula. It was also used as an accompaniment to grain offerings. Its primary symbolic register in a Jewish context was priestly and sacred. This substance belongs in the presence of God. A gift of frankincense to a child carries the suggestion that this child belongs in that same register. Myrrh is the most arresting of the three, because its primary associations in the ancient world were with death. Myrrh is a resin from the commiphora tree, also native to Arabia and East Africa, and it was used extensively in embalming. The Egyptians used it in mummification, and it appears throughout ancient texts as a preparation for burial. It was also used as a component of anointing oil, as a medicine and analgesic, and as a perfume. But the embalming association was strong enough that presenting myrrh as a gift to a newborn carried an unmistakable shadow. Readers familiar with the rest of Matthew's Gospel, or with any of the other three Gospels, would find the resonance deepened by John 19:39, which records that Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes to prepare Jesus' body for burial after the crucifixion. The myrrh appears at the beginning of Matthew's story and at the end of John's, and the bookend is not accidental. Christian tradition has read this three-part symbolism as a prophetic triptych pointing to the identity of Christ: gold for his kingship, frankincense for his divinity and priesthood, myrrh for his death and the sacrifice it would entail. Origen made this interpretation explicit in the 3rd century, and it has been developed and repeated in Christian preaching and hymnody ever since. The carol We Three Kings encodes the interpretation in its final 3 verses, each one devoted to a single gift and its symbolic meaning. Whether Matthew himself intended this precise threefold symbolism is a question scholars debate. Matthew was fully capable of that kind of structured theological meaning. His gospel is full of it. But the text does not announce the interpretation the way it would if Matthew were certain he wanted it seen. What is clear is that the tradition found the symbolism irresistible, and that the symbolic reading is ancient, sophisticated, and deeply embedded in how these gifts have been understood for nearly 2,000 years. There is also a more earthbound reading that deserves equal time. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh were not merely symbolic objects. They were among the most valuable trade commodities in the ancient world. Frankincense and myrrh were literally worth their weight in gold at various points in antiquity. They were the luxury goods of the ancient economy, transported across hundreds of miles of desert on the incense roads of Arabia, taxed by every kingdom they passed through, and hoarded by the wealthy. A collection of gold, frankincense, and myrrh was not a symbolic gesture. It was a small fortune. Several commentators across the centuries have noted the practical implication of this. The Holy Family, according to Matthew 2:13-15, fled to Egypt almost immediately after the Magi's visit. Egypt was not a free destination. Travel, lodging, and subsistence in a foreign country for an unspecified number of years required resources. The gifts the Magi brought may have been, among other things, the funding mechanism for the refugee family's survival. That reading does not diminish the symbolic one. Ancient texts and ancient gifts can carry meaning on multiple registers simultaneously. The frankincense could signal priestly holiness and pay for a month of lodging at the same time. These are not competing interpretations. They are layered ones. One last note on the gifts and the number question, since the two are inseparable. Matthew says the Magi opened their treasures and presented gifts, plural, 3 named items. He does not say each magus opened his own treasury. He does not say one presented gold, while another presented frankincense, and a third presented myrrh. The text describes a collective act. They opened their treasures, and from those treasures came these 3 things. The one gift per person assumption is so deeply embedded in the tradition that it feels like reading, but it is not reading. It is inference. A delegation of 12 could open their collective stores and present 3 categories of gift with no difficulty at all. The 3 gifts generated the tradition of 3 magi because the inference was natural and the symmetry was pleasing. But the inference is still an inference, and the gifts are the only numerically fixed detail in the entire passage. They are the most theologically dense point in Matthew's account, the hinge on which the entire number tradition turns, and quite possibly the most consequential 12 words in the history of Christmas iconography. Ask most people what the 3 wise men were named, and they will tell you without hesitation: Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. The names feel old. They feel biblical. They have the weight of antiquity about them, sonorous, foreign, carrying the faint echo of incense and desert wind. They appear on the shrine of the 3 kings in Cologne Cathedral, one of the most famous reliquaries in Christendom. They are inscribed on centuries of European art. They are written above doorways in chalk on Epiphany across half the Catholic world. Children learn them alongside the Lord's Prayer. They feel as settled and permanent as anything in the Christian tradition. They are not in the Bible, not in Matthew, not anywhere in the New Testament, not in the Old Testament, not in any apocryphal gospel, not in any early Christian text of the 1st or 2nd century. Matthew 2:1 through 2:12 gives the Magi no names whatsoever, not a single one of them. Not a personal name, not a title, not so much as a descriptive epithet that might have crystallized into a name later. The visitors from the East in Matthew's account are as anonymous as the shepherds in Luke's, which is to say, completely. If you read only the Bible, you will never learn what these men were called, because the Bible never says. The earliest known written source that attaches the names Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar specifically to the Magi is a Greek manuscript from Alexandria, Egypt, dated to approximately the 6th century of the Common Era. This places the first recorded appearance of the names roughly 500 years after the events Matthew describes. The manuscript not only names them, but assigns each a nationality and a physical description. Melchior is presented as an old man from Persia, white-haired and bearded. Caspar, sometimes spelled Gaspar, is young and beardless from India. Balthazar is dark-skinned and bearded from Arabia. The 3 figures are arranged to represent 3 ages of human life, and more importantly, 3 of the known continents of the ancient world. This is a theological statement wearing the costume of biography. The Magi represent all of humanity, young and old, Eastern and Southern and Western, every people under heaven, coming to worship the Christ child. The names and descriptions are not history recovered. They are theology expressed through invented particulars. It is worth pausing on the 500-year gap. The people who attached these names to the Magi were writing half a millennium after the Magi would have lived and died. They had no access to records, no chain of testimony, no archival source that could tell them what these travelers were called. What they had was Matthew's text, the theological tradition that had grown up around it, and the creative impulse to give faces and names to figures that had become central to Christian devotion. The naming was an act of piety and imagination, not of scholarship or memory. The Cologne Cathedral connection is perhaps the most audacious chapter in this story. In 1164, the Archbishop of Cologne brought relics from Milan. Bones claimed to be the physical remains of the three Magi. Their arrival transformed Cologne Cathedral into one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in medieval Europe. The Shrine of the Three Kings, a massive golden reliquary housing them, remains in the cathedral today. Nobody in the chain of custody ever explained how bones of unknown origin had been identified as belonging to three specific men from the 1st century BCE, whose names had not appeared in any written source until 5 centuries after their supposed deaths. The relics arrived labeled. The labels were accepted. The physical presence of the bones made the names feel confirmed, and the pilgrimage trade that grew up around the shrine provided a powerful incentive to avoid scrutiny. The Feast of Epiphany, celebrated on January 6th, became the liturgical anchor for the Magi story. The feast is genuinely ancient, observed at least as early as the 3rd century, long predating the attachment of specific names to the visitors. For much of Christian history, it was the more theologically significant of the two winter celebrations, marking the manifestation of Christ to the Gentile world, as the names of Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar settled into the annual commemoration. The feast became the vehicle that carried the invented particulars into permanent memory, alongside the genuine theological content. Not all Christians received the same names. This is the detail that most thoroughly dismantles any claim to historical authenticity for any of the naming traditions. The Syriac Church, one of the oldest continuous Christian communities in the world, tracing its origins to the 1st century, and worshipping in a language closely related to the Aramaic Jesus spoke, used entirely different names. In Syriac tradition, the Magi were called Lavandad, Hormizdas, and Gushnasaf, Persian names, consistent with the Zoroastrian priestly identity that the word Magoi implies, and bearing no resemblance to Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. The Armenian Christian tradition, equally ancient, names them Kagfa, Badadakarida, and Badadilma. The existence of at least 3 entirely different and mutually incompatible naming traditions, none of which appears in the Bible, none of which can be traced to any historical source within 5 centuries of the events described, is its own kind of proof. If any of the traditions were recovering genuine historical memory, they would converge. They do not converge. They diverge in every direction, because all of them are inventions, generated independently by communities doing the same thing, giving human particularity to figures that the foundational text had deliberately left without it. Why did Matthew not name them? The most plausible answers are 2. Either he did not know their names, they were travelers from a foreign land who came, gave gifts, and went home, and no record of their identities survived to Matthew's time. Or he did not consider their names relevant to the point he was making. Matthew's Magi are not characters in a novel. They are theological representatives. They stand for the Gentile world. Naming them would individualize them, make them specific people from specific families with specific identities, and in doing so, shrink the scope of what they represent. Leaving them nameless keeps them universal. They are whoever comes from the east to seek the light. They are everyone and no one. That anonymity may have been a choice, not an oversight. The names Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar are a 6th century literary invention that became a medieval cultural certainty, and then a modern biblical assumption. They are beautiful names. They carry genuine historical resonance from the traditions that preserved them. But they are not ancient, and they are not biblical, and the confidence with which they are repeated as fact is itself a small monument to how thoroughly a tradition can displace a text. Traditions do not usually arrive fully formed. They do not appear one morning complete and settled, handed down from a single authoritative source at a single moment in time. They accrete. They build up the way sediment builds, layer by layer, particle by particle, each deposit so thin as to be nearly invisible while it is falling, until after enough time has passed, the accumulation is so deep that the original surface is nowhere visible, and the accumulated layers feel like the ground itself. What feels most ancient is often what was added most recently, because the most recent additions have been repeated the most times, and have had the most opportunity to feel inevitable. The image of 3 crowned kings named Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, riding camels across a desert to kneel beside shepherds at a manger under a blazing star. This is not one tradition. It is a composite of at least 7 distinct layers of accretion, each with a specific origin point, each added at a specific moment in history for a specific reason, and each so thoroughly merged with the others that they feel like a single, ancient, unified whole. They are not. Pull them apart, and you find a timeline stretching across 17 centuries of creative interpretation. The first layer is the only one that belongs to Matthew. Sometime in the last 2 decades of the 1st century, a Jewish Christian community composed the gospel in his name. They wrote about unnamed, unnumbered magoi, Zoroastrian priest astronomers, traveling from an unspecified eastern location to visit a house where they found a young child and presented 3 gifts. That is the text. 12 verses. Spare, strange, and deliberately unelaborated. The second layer arrived within a generation or 2. Theologians of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Origen, read the Magi account through the lens of Old Testament prophecy. Psalm 72 and Isaiah 60 spoke of kings bringing gifts and bowing down. These texts were read as forecasting the Magi's visit, and the Magi were consequently identified as the fulfillment of royal prophecy. The word kings entered the tradition not from Matthew's text, but from this interpretive overlay. Origen also connected the 3 gifts to 3 visitors, establishing the number 3 with the theological weight of his authority behind it. Neither the royal title nor the specific number were in the text. Both entered through the exegetical tradition of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The third layer is the names. Around the 6th century, a Greek manuscript from Alexandria assigned identities to the anonymous figures: Melchior, an old man from Persia; Caspar, a young man from India; Balthazar, a bearded man from Arabia. 3 ages, 3 continents, 1 symbolic claim. All humanity has come to Christ. The names were invented to carry a theological argument. They were literary creations, not recovered history, and they arrived 5 centuries after the events they purported to describe. The 4th layer is the most physically imposing. In 1164, bones claimed to be the Magi's remains arrived in Cologne. Relics changed things in ways that manuscripts could not. A manuscript tells you something. Bones prove it. The shrine of the three kings gave Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar a material existence, a location, a weight, a physical presence that transformed invented names into apparent historical persons. Physical relics foreclose questions that texts invite. The shrine made Cologne rich, made the names permanent, and made scrutiny feel like impiety. The fifth layer is paint. From the 13th century onward, the greatest artists of Western civilization depicted the Magi in elaborate, visually authoritative nativity scenes. Botticelli painted them. Leonardo da Vinci left an unfinished adoration of the Magi of haunting power. Dürer and Rubens rendered them repeatedly. These were not illustrations of a text. They were theological statements in pigment, and because a painting lodges in memory differently than a sentence does, these images shaped popular understanding more powerfully than any commentary. They showed kings because that had been the theological identification since the 3rd century. 3 of them, because origin. Beside the shepherds at a manger, because the composite was already devotional norm. On camels, because Isaiah 60 had been attached to the story for centuries. Every standardized detail felt, to its viewers, like documentary accuracy. The final layers came in quick succession. Commercial Christmas cards appeared in England in the 1840s, and the nativity scene became a standard image almost immediately. We Three Kings followed in 1857. Department stores sold painted nativity sets. Film and television fixed the composite image in the 20th century and distributed it globally. By the time the mass media finished their work, what the Bible says about the Magi was, for most people, whatever had been on the Christmas cards their parents sent. The composite had become the original. Throughout all of this, Jerome's Latin Vulgate had been doing quiet damage of its own. Jerome translated Magoi correctly as Magi in the 5th century, but the commentary tradition surrounding the Vulgate increasingly used the Latin word reges, kings, alongside Magi, and in popular preaching and devotional writing, the two terms became effectively interchangeable. By the High Medieval period, Rex and Magos described the same figure in Christmas culture, and no one could quite remember that they had once been different words pointing to different categories of human being. When someone is told that the 3 wise men are not in the Bible, that Matthew says magi, not kings, that Matthew gives no number, that the stable belongs to Luke, that the names are 6th century inventions, the response is often not intellectual engagement, but emotional resistance. This is understandable. The tradition is not an abstraction. It is the pageant costume a child wore at 7. It is the ornament on the tree every December for 40 years. It is the carol sung by a congregation that has been singing it together since childhood. Being told it is not in the Bible can feel like being told a beloved family member was never real. The feeling is worth acknowledging, but there is a distinction that makes the correction less threatening than it first appears. The difference between what Matthew wrote and what Christians have celebrated. Those are not the same category of thing, and they do not need to be. A tradition can be beautiful and meaningful and worth preserving, while also being distinct from the text it grew out of. Knowing that the nativity scene is a composite, that the names were invented in the 6th century, that the camels are Isaiah's rather than Matthew's, this knowledge does not dissolve the tradition. It simply locates it accurately. The tradition is the tradition. The text is the text. Each layer of accretion made sense in its time and served a real purpose, theological, devotional, artistic, liturgical. But together they buried Matthew's account under 17 centuries of creative elaboration and excavating back down to what he actually wrote is worth the effort. Chapter 12. What Matthew actually wrote. We have been working our way through a short passage, 12 verses. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. A passage that most people in the Western world would say they already know, would say they learned in childhood, have seen depicted hundreds of times, could summarize in 30 seconds without pausing to think. And yet, when you read those 12 verses slowly, the way we have been reading them in the preceding chapters, what you find is that the familiar summary and the actual text are two quite different things. It is worth, at the end of this journey, laying out precisely what Matthew wrote and what he did not write in the same place, side by side, so that the distance between them can be seen clearly. Matthew wrote that Magi came to Jerusalem from the east. He did not write that there were 3 of them. He did not write that they were kings. He did not write that they were named Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. He did not write that they arrived on the night of the birth. He did not write that they went to a stable. He wrote that they entered a house, and that the child they found there was living in that house with his mother. A scene that implies not the chaos of a birth night, but the settled arrangement of a household, however modest. He wrote that they brought 3 gifts. He did not write that each gift corresponded to one visitor. He wrote that they followed a star, which stopped over the place where the child was. But he said nothing about what kind of object that star was, how long it took them to travel, or whether anyone else could see it. That is the text. Everything else, the number, the crowns, the camels, the names, the stable, the synchronized arrival with the shepherds on the night of the birth, is tradition. Not fabrication in the dishonest sense, and not nothing. These accretions accumulated over centuries through genuine theological reasoning, genuine artistic creativity, and genuine devotional labor. But they are not Matthew. The question that naturally arises from this kind of comparison is whether it matters. And the answer, like most honest answers, is that it depends on what you are trying to do. If you are producing a nativity pageant for a primary school in December, it almost certainly does not matter very much. The children in their robes are participating in a living tradition that stretches back through centuries of Christian practice, and no amount of close reading is going to change the fact that the tradition is beautiful, that it has served real purposes, and that it continues to serve them. The pageant is the pageant. It was never meant to be a scholarly commentary on the Greek text of Matthew. But if what you are trying to do is understand what Matthew wrote, what he meant, what argument he was constructing, what he was trying to convey to his original audience, then it matters considerably. Because the tradition, taken whole, actually obscures Matthew's argument. It imports a stable from Luke's Gospel, which Matthew does not mention. It imports shepherds, who belong entirely to Luke and do not appear anywhere in Matthew. It collapses a visit that Matthew locates at some unspecified point after the birth into the birth night itself, destroying the temporal gap that Matthew's own narrative requires, the gap in which Herod waits for the Magi to return, gives up waiting when they do not, and then calculates how old the child might now be, based on when the star first appeared, a calculation that in Matthew 2:16 yields an age of up to 2 years. There is no 2-year span in a scene that takes place on the night of the birth. Matthew's Herod knows it is not the night of the birth. Matthew's reader is supposed to know it too. What Matthew is actually writing is a carefully constructed theological argument about who this child is and who is going to recognize him. The argument is built through contrast. On one side, the Magi, foreigners from the East, practitioners of a tradition entirely outside the covenant of Israel, who nevertheless see the sign in the sky and follow it all the way to its source. On the other side, Herod, the sitting king of the Jews, who hears the news of a rival king and responds not with worship, but with the machinery of state violence. And behind Herod, in his palace, the chief priests and scribes of the Jewish establishment, who know exactly where the Messiah is supposed to be born, can quote the prophecy from memory, and then do nothing with the knowledge. They tell Herod. They do not go to Bethlehem themselves. That is Matthew's arrangement. The people with every reason to recognize this child, every scripture, every credential, every proximity, they do not go. The people with no reason to recognize him, no covenant, no scripture in the native language, no stake in the question of a Jewish Messiah, they travel an enormous distance and bow down. Matthew is making an argument about insiders and outsiders, about who sees and who does not, about the direction in which the news of this birth was going to travel across the world. He is making that argument in 12 verses. Every element in those 12 verses is selected to serve that argument. The tradition buries the argument. When the Magi arrive simultaneously with the shepherds on the birth night, surrounded by golden light and heavenly choirs, in a scene of universal joy and recognition, the contrast Matthew was building between those who had every reason to see and did not, and those who had no reason and did, disappears entirely. The pageant makes it look as though everyone who was supposed to show up showed up. Matthew is at pains to show you that they did not. None of this requires believing or not believing the underlying events. You can hold the story as history, as theology, as literature, as all three at once, and still find it worthwhile to ask what the author actually wrote. The question is not about faith, it is about reading. It is about the difference between receiving a text and receiving a tradition about a text, and knowing which one you are doing at any given moment. The 3 wise men are not in the Bible. The word Matthew uses is magoi, which means something more specific, more historically grounded, and more theologically purposeful than wise men or kings. The number 3 is not in the text. The names are not in the text. The stable is not in the text. The night of the birth is not in the text. The simultaneous arrival with the shepherds is not in the text. What is in the text is a group of foreign astrologer priests, number unspecified, who follow a celestial sign to a house in Bethlehem and present gifts to a child, and in doing so become the first Gentiles in Matthew's Gospel to recognize and worship the one Matthew has been introducing since his very first verse. That is a more interesting story than the greeting card version. It is stranger, more historically layered, more theologically precise, more surprising in its implications. It has Zoroastrian or Babylonian scholars reading the Jewish sky and understanding it better than the Jewish establishment did. It has a paranoid Hellenistic client king doing the research his own advisors had already done for him and then trying to weaponize the findings. It has a child in a house, not a manger, at a remove from the birth night that the narrative itself requires, being found at last by people who were looking from the beginning. Matthew wrote that story. 17 centuries of creative tradition wrote the other one, over the top of it, in good faith and with genuine love for the subject. The tradition is not the enemy of the text, but the tradition is not the text. Go back and read those 12 verses. Read them in any modern translation you trust, slowly, with only the words on the page. You will find a man named Herod, a city named Bethlehem, a star, a house, 3 gifts, and a group of magi, whose number Matthew never troubled to count. You will not find a stable. You will not find shepherds. You will not find Caspar. You will not find a scene of universal joy. You will find something more honest than all of that, and more unsettling, and in the long run more worth knowing. A story about who saw and who looked away.